are now about to be recording, just so you know that. It's complicated not only for those who are grieving the loss of a loved one, of course, but for congregations when a beloved member has died, for clergy, and for those who provide funeral services. And as we all know, since March, when Governor Mills issued an emergency order that limited gatherings to 10 or fewer people, and so did the CDC, the national CDC for that matter, we've all been operating in new territory that is unfamiliar to navigate. So we decided to offer this opportunity, all of us make these hard and necessary decisions within difficult constraints, and that they are for sure. And in the hope that together, number one, we can help stop the spread of the coronavirus. That is our mission as people of God right now, as people of faith. That has to come before anything else, even grief, even loss or death. And then secondly, to provide compassionate care and services to those who are in the midst of grief. So not only do we want to talk about the limits we're all facing while stay-at-home orders remain in place, but we hope to spend time in the middle third of this presentation talking about what's going to happen when restrictions lift. And there will be a tidal wave of all those postponed funerals happening. It will impact probably all of us, and we can think creatively together about how to manage that when it happens. And then in addition to these sorts of practical nuts and bolts things that I've just mentioned, we really want to spend some time together in wonderful talk the other day about this, thinking together about how we make meaning out of this, in the midst of and after this pandemic, when it comes to death and grief and mourning and healing. So I'll introduce very briefly to you our presenters this morning, but you should have received a document in advance that gave you detailed bios on all of them. I want to say how grateful we are to each and every one of the people I'm about to introduce you to for their giving us their time today and their wisdom. My co-host today is the Vice President of the Maine Council of Churches, Miss Carolyn Lambert, there in the beautiful sunrise. She, as I said, is our Vice President and also a chaplain to the Kennebunk Fire and Police Departments, has served lots of congregational churches in her career in ministry and has done lots of other interesting things as well that you can read about. I mentioned already, I'm the Executive Director, and our President, Alyssa Lodewick, is also on call today. Hi, Alyssa. A UCC minister currently serving the Woodford's Church as well as the Maine Council of Churches. Our panelist today, who's the manager of Jones and Rich, and you can see that funeral home in the background of his virtual background on his screen. So from Jones and Rich. And then we have Kevin Simoneau, who's a general manager of the Fortin Group Funeral Home in Auburn. So we really wanted to be geographically diverse in the voices we brought to the table this morning. I'm glad that we aren't just Portland-centric today. We have Mike Martell, who is on the board of directors of the Maine Funeral Directors Association and brings a regional and geographic overview that goes even beyond the limits of Maine. Doug Bibber is here. He's the vice president of the Bibber Memorial Chapels in Kennebunk, Wells, and Berwick. That's where my family has deep, deep roots in that part of the state going back to 1650. So I would wager that the Bibber folks have buried some of my ancestors and family members over the years. And Doug Whitmore, now I see why Carolyn refers to them as the Dougs. Doug Whitmore is the manager of Bibber Memorial Chapels in Wells, Berwick, and Kennebunk. A few logistics before we get going this morning. As I mentioned, we are recording this, so be aware that you are being recorded and that a link to the recording of this meeting will be made available through the Maine Council of Churches website in a few days after this is concluded. We've all lived on Zoom, so I'm guessing you guys know this, but just to go over it one more time, it's helpful to stay muted if you're not the one talking because it reduces background noise and things like barking dogs and kids asking for popsicles and ringing phones and, you know, all the things that happen when we're at home. I'm going to invite you to hover your cursor down over the bottom of your screens, and you'll see an orange box that says chat. And Alyssa has put a message in, so you'll see what that looks like when someone sends a chat to everyone, says, are we recording this? And the answer is yes. But down below where it says to, you see a box that says everyone. If you click on the arrow next to it, the next name underneath should be Carolyn Lambert, co-host. What I'm going to be asking you to do throughout the morning, our time, if you think of a question you'd like to ask our panelists, click to send a message just to Carolyn. And she'll be collecting your questions, collating them, combining them, preparing them. And she's going to run the second half of this meeting and use a discussion, use those questions in a discussion with our panelists. So feel free to be using that chat box and sending messages to Carolyn as we go along. Finally, this is scheduled to be about an hour and 15 minutes long, and that isn't very much time to talk about the big things that we're going to be talking about. So Carolyn and I are going to be listening very closely to hear if it sounds like we might need to schedule a follow-up conversation, and if it does seem that's what we're going to do, we will do that. As I mentioned, you should have received some background materials from me over the last few days. If you just registered this morning after about 9:30 a.m., I probably missed you, but I can get this document to you afterward. In it, you will have the bios of all the people I just introduced you to and much more. You will have notes from a meeting that many of you were probably on April 17th that Tarlin Amadoff at Catholic Charities hosted. That talked with folks from the state level CDC and regulatory commission about some very practical things about funerals. And we may cover a little bit of that material today, but this is probably going to go in a slightly different direction than that meeting did. Second in that document are the state of Maine guidelines for funeral directors. And I know not everyone on this call, most of you are not funeral directors, but if you read it, there's very pertinent information in that letter from Commissioner Ann Head that would be helpful for you to know as a clergy person. And then finally, from my colleague in Massachusetts, Laura Everett, the executive director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches, is an excellent document that if you haven't seen already, you should read. It's really designed for clergy. It's very pastoral in its approach to handling grief and funerals during this time of pandemic, and I recommend it to you highly. Laura does extraordinary work, and this is an example of that. So with all those things said, I'm going to ask some questions of our panelists for about a half an hour, and then Carolyn will take over. Remember to be sending your questions to her. And Doug Whitmore, you are up to bat first. So I'd like to ask you to reflect with us a little bit about while the stay-at-home order is remaining in effect, and how that means we cannot follow the things all of us have done, you know, as ordinary business, usual business, in helping grieving families, in leading traditions and rituals, and the things we just know to expect. Those are all thrown into disarray through this experience. And we want to know from you wisdom about managing expectations of those who are grieving, of ourselves, of our congregations, and the very likely disappointments that come with expectations here and reality over here. How do we help them make choices about whether to postpone or whether to have a service right away? What things need to be considered in those choices? And in 5 minutes or less, also, do you see any trends in what families are choosing to do in this time? And Doug, there you are on my screen. I'll go ahead and unmute you and take it away. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jane. And it is a good question. It's a difficult question. But I feel as though that most families already know what the limits are when they call us. It's on the news every single day. What I like to think of is that we're the first people that start to say yes to them. So we try to present some different ideas. Services are different. We've got to follow those protocols, but we can be the first ones that can offer them to come in and view their loved one. Oftentimes, we're finding some of our patients or our clients, our client families are COVID related, and they haven't been able to visit their loved ones in those last weeks. They've been separated from the nursing home. There's been no physical presence whatsoever. It's difficult for them. And so we try to offer that, if there is a chance to come in and see. And that's the first time they've been told yes in a while. And we do have to take some time and talk about what we can offer for services with the limitations that are placed on us now. And they're extreme. Let's face it, we all know that, what we're living with. But there are certain things that we can do. We can still have viewings. We have to limit. We used to have viewings for a 30-minute period. Now we do 4 hours, and they're by invite so that small groups can come in at a time. We don't want a large group out in our parking lot waiting, so we schedule each of the groups. We'd like to get a list of the names that are able to come. The other thing that we're doing, that we try to do, is actually we do some arrangements over the telephone if that's what the family's comfortable with. But if we can in any way see them safely, we invite that. That power of presence is so important right now, just to be able to meet someone face to face, even at a distance. Well, we're usually about 10 feet away. It's important, and take the time and listen to them, listen to what their needs are, what their wants are. And oftentimes just listen to them talk about their experience over the last couple of weeks. It's different. They haven't been able to release that emotion and story to anyone else. And so, we're there. And I think it's important for clergy now, a phone call, just to reach out. It's so important. But the truth is, we can't have our regular visitations at night. We can't have a service in the church. And so it has been disappointing to the family. But what we try to do is offer some other suggestions. We do some delayed services, but we're also having some graveside services within certain parameters. And that's provided meaning for families. And we're trying to create new traditions. It's a difficult thing to do. Sometimes we have to sit around and just talk a little bit outside the box. What can we do to make the service meaningful, for the families? And so we try to do that. So I know that our initial meetings are a lot longer than they ever used to be, just because we're talking about possibilities. And we have to listen to the family and help them make the decision as to whether to wait or not wait. Some families, most of their families and friends are from out of state. Here in southern Maine, that's a very real thing. People come up here and retire, but they've left everyone else behind. And for those, it's difficult. And so we do have to wait oftentimes. We just can't bring everybody in. So, those are some of the things we're facing. But I think the most important thing is to listen to the people and give them an opportunity to express their thoughts and desires. And that helps to manage some of the disappointments that come about. And as I say, I like to be the first ones that can start to say yes to them.
I love that, Doug. That's a wonderful frame. And I hadn't thought about that seeing their loved one deceased is the first time they've been in the same room with them. Sometimes
That's right.
That's extraordinary. And you're doing amazing ministry of presence is what we in the church world might call it. That probably really turns the experience for the family from one of being told no, no, no to yes, and let's think together about how to make this meaningful, despite these difficult constraints. So thank you for the work you're doing. And thank you for that answer. I already learned something, and we're only 5 minutes in. And folks, I encourage you to use the speaker view. If you didn't already, it helps to really focus on the person speaking. I changed my screen to that, and as the host, it might have flipped your screen too. If you wondered why suddenly Doug was very big in the middle of your screen, that's why. But in a group this big, that can be a helpful way to focus. I'm going to turn my attention to the other Doug, to Doug Bibber, and ask you the next question, which is, if a family does decide to hold a service now, in the midst of the stay-at-home order, while these restrictions are all in place, how can planning and pastoral care be carried out? What logistical decisions, as opposed to philosophical and emotional decisions, what are the logistics that a family and a clergy person would need to work out with your help? And also, if you could address any issues that arise if, in fact, the cause of death was COVID-19 as opposed to another cause of death. So
Certainly.
you go right ahead and take
Okay.
it away.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting all of us funeral professionals this morning. I think this is a great, great opportunity to share together. Doug has already kind of spoke some of a common theme I think you're going to find. We have done some arrangements by phone, email, video. We've also had in-person arrangements taking into account the guidelines of distancing, hand washing, and sanitizing. For us, we sit at opposite ends of a 6-foot table, and we also limit the number of people that we're meeting with. I think as clergy, I think it's going to be hard to meet by phone if someone is ill, because when we first receive a call, we have kind of a small checklist. We ask if anybody in the family is ill, because we've got to take that into consideration before we come into physical presence with surviving family members. If there's a family member that has had COVID, what is the chance that the rest of the family may be exposed in some way? So we've got to take that into account, and we've got to ask those questions ahead of time. But we do try to meet, taking into account the guidelines. And then the challenge for all of us is to resist the temptation to give that hug to the family, because that's one of the most important things that we all can do to the folks that would normally allow that. So we've got to find other ways to convey our empathy and sympathy to the family. And that'll be different for everybody that we meet with. And Doug Whitmore talked about it a little bit, is listening, talking with family and listening, finding out what's important and what has been missing to the surviving family members, and trying to fill that void in some manner. And the church family certainly can follow suit, and we all as a community come around the surviving family members. A couple of things that we need to keep in mind is that there's a lot of different viewpoints out there on this COVID thing, and some don't see it as too serious, others do. But we've got to take it serious, so we're not going from family A to family B and possibly transmitting something. So we've got to keep that in our minds. But most of the families that I'm meeting with acknowledge that, and they're coming in with their masks on already. So we don't have to have one mask here at our office ready for them. They're not using them, they have their masks already. The families that are deciding to have services, a lot of my professional brothers and sisters are using electronic means, whether they're FaceTiming, Zoom funerals, or a lot of other electronic means to have a very small gathering in the building, and then a wider audience. And there's mixed results. Some are saying they've had really good results with it. Others have brought up the fact that once their service that is either live or been recorded has been put out onto, say, through Google or Facebook, has been blocked because of licensing of the music. Mm-hmm. And that's an issue that has occurred to some of my compatriots out in the center of the country. They've had their services blocked. Yep. So our ABSCAM, I call it ABSCAM. ASCAP license allows us to play music in-house, but it doesn't allow us to broadcast. So we're getting blocked because we're broadcasting it over the internet. So those are some things that need to be taken into account. Some funeral homes are broadcasting the service without any music and getting around that hurdle. So it's really what kind of works for each individual funeral home, church, and family that whose service is for the loved one.
Yes.
Speaking specifically to a person that has died of COVID, you know, the literature, and let me tell you, for the month of April, I could have sat at my desk and just read information, email information after email information on almost information overload, trying to discern out some of the information to try to do other things. One of the things that I saw was from the World Health Organization saying that embalming is not recommended.
Mm-hmm.
And from the national CDC, that is different in that with the professionalism, the level of education and experience of U.S. funeral directors that are licensed nationwide, they do, following protocols that we've had in place since the AIDS epidemic, of personal protective gear. That allows us to embalm and have services, or if as Doug was mentioning, families that have been separated in nursing homes, if we're allowed and given permission to embalm, it allows the family to come into the presence of their loved one to have a goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, if embalming isn't done, then we couldn't do that because of the transmissibility. But with the embalming, following CDC guidelines, we are allowed to do that. So we're very comfortable sharing that with families and giving that option to families. Whether they take that option or not is up to them and what their customs are. Services can be held. Now, if there is a service with their loved one present after embalming, the CDC still asks the family members and participants not to touch the but the opportunity to come into that presence is powerful all on its own. So it can occur with the proper policies and practices in place. So we really want to make sure that families understand those options. We're having a lot of graveside services now, privately for families, and then they're planning to gather down the road for that public time, to have the public come in. Mm-hmm. But they're also holding off services, which I know we're going to talk about today. And coming out of wintertime, where we normally have our traditional spring burials, now we're adding in the folks that are delaying their services entirely because of the COVID situation. Mm-hmm. It will prove. So also, when we are having services, you know, the elements of the gathering afterwards is not occurring. No food.
No. Right.
We've at our firm, we have a candy bowl or mint bowl, and each individually wrapped. We've taken that out. Mm-hmm. Water bottles. We always have water bottles. Since February, not one family member has taken that water bottle. It's just that it's a touch point that they don't want to do right now, which is completely understandable. So it has changed, and I think some of these changes will be with us for a long time. Once the CD says we're good to get back together again, I think we're going to find a lot of changes will have occurred and will stay with us. So it'll be interesting to see what happens down the road. And I think it'll be a challenge that we've got to find ways to overcome.
I think you're absolutely right to slip into saying, let's get back to normal. There's no going back. There's going to be a new normal.
You can say it. You're welcome.
I am so thankful that you clarified the embalming question, because the April 17th event only mentioned the World Health Organization. And so I have learned something from you as well this morning, that it's different here in the US. And speaking of that and rules and what's applying in the US, I'm going to turn to Mike Martell now and We're going to continue where Doug Bibber left off with thinking about services that are happening now in the time of restrictions. And once that decision has been made, thinking about those specific rules and regulations that will come into play the day of the service. And suggestions for those of us clergy that are dealing with the families and interacting with the families, even if it's by phone or video, how we communicate those limitations in a compassionate way, given that they're really tough. It's really tough to say to somebody, you know, you can't have everyone here that you want. People coming from out of state would need to be able to stay for 2 weeks in a day because they need to quarantine. And there's a lot to think of. And Mike, you're unmuted, and the 5 minutes are yours to tell us more about all of those very complicated issues.
Sure thing. Yeah, and please interrupt me with questions. But thank you, Jane and Carolyn, and appreciate all the clergy on this webinar. I mean, what you're all doing gets right to, you know, we joke about the Zoom thing, but what you're doing cuts right to the relationship and what it means to be part of a church community, and those personal relationships combined with relationships with God. It's funny, you know, we enjoy the funny stories about Zoom and people getting on and all these crazy things, but when you peel it back, it really gets to the core of things. So I admire what you're doing and appreciate it. And Doug, you two are a tough act to follow. You're so eloquent. Appreciate you two. So I get to go over the rules. So at the beginning of April, the governor's office, when she really, you know, closed down everything, certainly the care of human remains was deemed essential. But so much of what we do was cut right out. And initially, the governor's notice cut out some key elements that we're even lucky to have today. And so by April 2nd, some provisions were added to the guidelines for funerals in Maine. And those provisions still stand as of today. And so those are the rules we're operating under until the governor's office changes things. So that's what I'm going to go over. You have that in your takeaway documents, but that's what I'll touch on. And there's really 4 points that the governor's office has allowed beyond the basic care of the human remains for us as funeral professionals and caregivers. The first piece deals with the funeral arrangements, and Doug both spoke of that. But the governor's office did allow a provision for us to make arrangements in person with 5 people, provided we use sterilized space, that we offer masks, that we offer gloves, that space is cleaned thoroughly. And, you know, as Doug so eloquently put it, you know, the family's ready to talk. And with some client families, as you know, with their own families that you're dealing with, some folks do fine with a Zoom medium or a WebEx medium. With modern technologies like DocuSign and so forth, certainly the business of death, if you will, can be done electronically. And there's a number of, I think most funeral professionals would agree, there's a number of client families that are comfortable doing that. But there's also a very large number that either they don't have the electronic medium to arrange that way, or as Doug said, they really just, they want to talk to someone and they want to share their story and they want to do that face to face. And as you all know, as clergy, that's where the dialogue starts with you. You know, a lot of times we're calling you and the family is with us. And so we were glad that the governor's office allowed that. Again, the specific law is 5 people to a segregated part of the funeral home. As you probably know, many times we make arrangements and 14 people come in the office or we're waiting to make arrangements for someone to come in from out of state. And obviously the prohibition affects all of those things. But you will find when you're working with a funeral professional, if they are live with the family, there's going to be at least 4 people there with them. And the law does allow for that. The second thing that the updated provisions of the law allow is a private viewing of the deceased. And I think Doug Whittemore mentioned that, and you've likely seen this, particularly if it's a COVID patient or someone who is in long-term care. You know, we're 60, 70 days into this thing now. If you think about it, there are those families, you know, they're and you know these people, you know that, you know, the gentleman who perhaps is visiting, you know, visiting his mother in the long-term care facility, and he visited every day on his way home from work. And now, you know, bang, come March 13th, that stopped. And here we are getting into the middle of May, and he hasn't been able to do that. And now a death has occurred. We really fought hard for this one, and the provision allows a private viewing of up to 5 people. You know, as practitioners in this profession, we believe that that's an element of the grief process, but I think more so than ever, I mean, people are just saying, gosh, I haven't seen my loved one. I want to have that opportunity to see them. So the law allows 5 people, and that works for private viewing. And as Doug said, and as many of our colleagues have done, you know, if they want some type of a viewing, most families are going to be more than 5 people. We're saying, okay, let's do this in shifts. You know, the brother Steve and his family come in at 2:15, and you know, Sister Sally comes in at 2:30, and so on and so forth. But that's how professionals have worked around that. You know, the other thing we've done is we have used closed circuit means, whether that's FaceTime or Zoom or WebEx, anything where we felt the security is strong enough to allow a visual identification using electronic media. And I'm thinking of a family where the spouse was quarantined due to COVID. The son was in Minnesota. Obviously, he wasn't going to come home and be quarantined for 14 days. And there was a daughter here in state. So we used that electric means, and they had a wonderful visit together. And they had this private visitation, if you will. There was 2 people live, 2 people electronically. The poor widow who was now quarantined because of all of this. And it was at 4:30, and she said, hey, can we stay on until 5? My husband and I always had a glass of scotch every day at 5 o'clock. That was our thing. And so I lump in my throat talking about it. You know, 5 o'clock, there she was on the screen toasting her husband with a glass of scotch. And I thought, you know, out of some of the most challenging things sometimes comes something so beautiful. And I felt everyone who was working with us that day thought, okay, we learned something. This is 2-3 years down the road. Maybe this is something in our bag of tricks as we as caregivers on this webinar can think of ways to use electronic media to help people. So with every challenge comes some good sometimes. But again, the rules is 5 people, again, in a sterilized manner, and certainly electronic medium is allowed. The third item that we got some provisions on was the acceptance of the cremated remains. And in Maine, a lot of families select cremation in 2020 here in Maine. And not every family has those cremated remains interred in a cemetery. A number of families take them home, or they're going to do a scattering event. And the receipt of those cremated remains really is an emotional high point. It's emotionally charged. We've always believed it needs to be done right in a caring fashion. And the governor's office allowed us to have a provision to allow 2 people to come in face to face. We didn't want to be mailing someone's loved one back to them. And so, you know, we felt that was a really important provision. We're pleased the governor, again, has allowed that. And the fourth item is the interment or the burial. And of course, that is, you know, that's that graveside scene at the cemetery. And the other 3 categories that I described, the governor's office only allowed 5 people. For the interment or the cemetery scene outside, the governor's office has allowed 10 people to be outside. And so, again, we've been able to facilitate those burials, small graveside services with clergy, with staff. Again, it's on the funeral director, the funeral professional to provide masks or gloves, which is tough these days. We don't always have the best supply chain, but mask and gloves for those attending. Sometimes we've had to provide them to the cemetery workers, and so that continues to be a work in progress. But if I would have to gauge the state of Maine, there's probably been a few more graveside burials, and we really wanted to make sure that provision was in there, because we were kind of looking forward to the month of May, when in a state like Maine, there's a lot of spring burials for those poor families who had an interment at a cemetery that isn't open in the wintertime. And we wanted to make sure we could facilitate that without having, you know, gosh, this backlog going back into August for spring burials. So the law does allow that. Again, I've heard great stories about electronic mediums used for graveside services. We're working with one Jewish family. You know, there was 130 people that were on the the FaceTime Live piece, and I thought, gosh, I don't remember the last time I had 130 graveside service. So, certainly, again, the electronic medium has been helpful. And in those cases, obviously, those services won't be backlogged. So that's what the governor's office has allowed. I think the association and the professionals that we work with here in this state, that you work with here in this state, really look forward to being able to find more provisions and more ways to ease restrictions when it's prudent, when it's safe, when it's healthy. I can tell you on calls we've had, there's not one of us that wants anyone to be able to come back and say people got sick going to a funeral. That goes against everything that everyone on this call wants to be doing. So we want to be just as careful as humanly possible and continue to be creative. But those are the laws as they are now. And again, we'll stay in communication as those change.
That's great. It's really helpful to hear that laid out. And thanks so much, Mike. I would also let you all know that the Council of Churches is in touch with the Maine CDC, in particular the state epidemiologist, Siri Bennett. She's been extraordinarily helpful to us, and we're in the process of publishing a document that's Maine specific. But the thing she keeps making sure we're clear about Maine, unlike some other states, these decisions that Mike just sort of laid out for you are being made in a data-driven way. So it isn't as if we all know some secret info that on June 1st, something's going to shift and it's going to be this number or that number, because they don't know. They're waiting and they're making those decisions very close to the moment they're announced because they're based on data. So we can't tell you all on this call today that on June 1st, anything will change or everything will change. We just don't know, and they don't know. And that, that makes things even more complicated than they already are. But I wanted to be sure you all knew that that's what we were hearing from the CDC. And we're going to shift a little bit now. Speaking of, we don't know when it's going to happen. We do know that it will happen. And there's going to come a day, probably sometime this summer, when restrictions will be lifted and the postponed funerals will start to happen. And I'm going to turn our attention to Kevin Simino to ask about that. How we together, clergy and funeral professionals, can prepare for that significant number of services that are going to happen once they're allowed, and how we can support each other, collaborate together, be creative about planning ahead to minimize the stress and the burnout on all of us and on the families, and ensure that every family gets the care that they deserve when that time comes. So Kevin, I'm going to unmute you and the 5 minutes are yours.
Perfect, thank you so much. So my best advice is get your sleep now and get caught up on it now, because you aren't going to get much probably when things open up. But no, seriously, like the two Dougs mentioned and Mike, that not only do we have to worry about these delayed services, but we also have to worry about the spring burial aspect of it. So we're going to kind of get hit with two whammies. And trying to plan for that and, being able to say yes to families that we can do it, but also, knowing we only have so much staff, we only have so many hearses. We're really going to have to communicate with each other. Hopefully, we will, when we talk to cemeteries, we're hoping that they will allow earlier and later burials. We're definitely going to have to be a lot more lenient as far as days and times of services when we can do it. What we do here at our funeral home is we kind of have two lists. We have our spring burial list, so we know what we need to do for spring burials. And we kind of have a delayed service list. What that delayed service list is, what services have happened, what services still need to happen. So for instance, we might have done the burial already, but we need to set up a service at church for this family once these guidelines have been lifted. And a checklist of what we need to do. With also this checklist or this delayed list we have, it's also a reminder to follow up with our families because their grief isn't done yet. They might not have had the closure, whether they just have done the burial or they just were able to view their loved one. They have not gone through the full grieving process, and that's the hardest part for us with dealing with these families. So we follow up with our families once a week, just to let them know we're still here, we're thinking of them, and see if they have any questions or concerns. The other thing we talk to families about is when we do get these guidelines lifted, let's make sure we have the time to plan this service. So let's plan a service that's really going to be meaningful and somewhat worth the wait, to really impact the family and the people that attend the service, to really get them to be a personalized service. It's really going to be a team effort to work together. It's going to be open-minded to different ideas and learning a new norm. I think there's going to be a lot of new normals that come out of this, and you know, to do a service at 9 and 11, you know, twice a day is not going to be feasible when these guidelines lift. So we're going to have to really focus on the families and be able to come up with unique ideas, different time frames. You know, looking at cemeteries and the locations of those cemeteries to where, you know, we kind of handle this end of town one day and handle the other side of town the other day. We're really going to have to, the timing's going to be crucial, and communication and planning between the staff at the funeral home and the clergy is just going to be crucial, and making sure that we can accommodate families. And it's the tough part is having that honest conversation with the family. You know, unfortunately, sometimes we might have to say no, and that's not something we're accustomed to. We don't say no to families. It's very rare. So when we do have to have those tough conversations, being as compassionate as possible and having them to try to understand that, you know, those, we already have services, or, you know, just that can't be possible that day, is going to be a very tough conversation to have with the family. So to try to give them other ideas and to give them other options to accommodate them is going to be key.
Yeah, I bet. I hadn't thought of a lot of the things you just laid out. And the first reaction, well, the very first reaction I have is, I love you because you say the way my father does. You say, I dear. And I love that. We grew up in Michigan. He's a Mainer, obviously, but I love that you say, I dear. But the real important thing I heard you say is that if clergy who are on this call, clergy anywhere in the state, haven't already done this, they need to reach out to their funeral professionals now. You know, a lot of us already have relationships with some or all of the funeral professionals in our town, but make sure that you've opened that door, you've begun that communication now. A lot of what we're telling clergy about lots of things is use this month of May to do your planning. We know now, because of last Wednesday, nothing's going to change till May 31st at the soonest. Make the most of this time. Deepen those relationships, open those lines of communication sooner rather than later. But thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And now we're going to switch to Eric Tyner before we open this up to everyone else's questions. And in many ways, Eric has a big challenge. They all had challenges, but my prayers are with you, Eric, because our questions for you come from the conversation Carolyn and I had. So if you feel overwhelmed, blame Carolyn, not me. And here we go. This is in many ways the deepest question underneath everything we've just talked about. We've been hearing now since March, this is like nothing we've ever experienced before in every area of our life, and death and mourning and grief are no exceptions. For families that have had a loved one die during this emergency, whether it was from COVID-19 or not, what does it mean logistically, emotionally, spiritually for them to be told in a sense, you have to push a pause button on your grief. You don't have immediate access to the kinds of rituals that we were used to, that our culture has relied on for generations, to help people walk through the experience of loss and grief. And what kind of care do these families need now, and in that limbo space between now and when they can actually hold the service that they wanted for their loved one. So Eric, go right ahead. I've unmuted you, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jane and Carolyn and everybody that's joined us today. I think it's really important to do this, and I was excited to hear that you were doing it, and very honored to be a part of it. So, looking at the questions that you pose, I think one of them logically, I think, and I think Doug and Mike and Kevin and everybody said this, is the families know what's going on. They're seeing it on the news, they're hearing it. They're not surprised when they call a funeral home that or a cemetery that we have these restrictions and way of doing things. So they're prepared for that. They know that it's coming. They're prepared themselves to hear that. Unfortunately, that part doesn't really translate over to the emotional and spiritual side of it. They still want to mourn their loved one. They still want to grieve their loved one. They still want to have the services that they have for their family member. And I think it's important, and you hear a lot of people say this, how are we going to postpone or push the pause button, or how are we going to not grieve right now for mom or dad or whoever that person is. And the one thing that I always say to them is, you're not going to pause it. You're still going to grieve right now. You still have to grieve. You can grieve with your family that you're there with. You can grieve with your friends, whether it be over the phone or on a Zoom meeting, but talk to people and still grieve. It may extend the grief period because we may have to wait for some different things, but you can't pause the grief. You couldn't pause the loss. You can't pause the grief. So I think it's important that we do that. And one of the things that I always try to wording I always try to use with the families and my colleagues and my family and everything is physical distancing rather than social distancing, because it social, you have to be social. If we aren't being social, we're in a lot of trouble. Can you imagine Carolyn not being social ever, even if it's on Zoom? I mean, but physically she's there, I'm here, and she's still putting smiles on our faces, right? So the social distancing, I don't think is a good wording. So I always try to use physical distancing, because we do have to do that. We do have to keep them safe. We have to keep us safe. And that's important. So I think that was one of the big things. We don't tell them to stop grieving. Start grieving. We have to extend that grieving period. We'll be with you to extend it. And the tough thing, which again, I can tell we're all funeral directors on here talking, because a lot of us are really saying a lot of the same thing in a sense, but the effects that it's having on the families while they're waiting is really hard, because I had a gentleman been married for 62 years over from Ocean View, which was one of the hot spots here in Portland. His entire family, him, his wife, his kids got the coronavirus, and his wife passed away. They'd been married for 64 years. So how now he's got to wait 14 days before he can even go out of the house. The facility that he lives on is on lockdown, and he's in that room by himself because the facility's locked down. So it's important now more than ever for us as funeral directors and clergy and friends and family to reach out and talk to and be in touch with these people over and over again. And Kevin mentioned they're calling their families on a weekly basis. I know Carolyn's mentioned to me she's done some graveside services for us, and she's calling her family sometimes bi-weekly to talk with them because they need to hear from somebody. I've had Zoom conferences with some of my widows or widowers just so they could see another face. because their kids are so busy or they didn't have kids. And so it's really important as caregivers to be able to do that until we get to the point where we're going to have that service for them. Keeping it normal, I think, is also an important thing, or as normal as we can, right? So I know Doug Whitmore in the beginning talked about still having families come in if they can. Any family that wants to come into the funeral home, we need to do that. We don't need to shelter them out and say, geez, no, you can only meet us over Zoom or over WebEx or on the phone. So making sure that we're doing that as much as possible, going back on what Mike talked about, following the regulations that the government set out for us. They're there, we have to follow them. We can't change them. So we can only make it as normal as we can for the things that are out there. You mentioned a little bit that, grief work is kind of a complicated thing, and the pain around it is complicated. And then you throw this pandemic piece in and it really compounds everything and makes it really challenging. And it does. And I think for our families it does. And I think for us as clergy and funeral professionals that it makes it really hard for us too. Because when we meet with these families, we give them the hug or we shake their hand, or, when the clergy comes to the facility, I did one with Carolyn the other day. It was so hard to stay 6 feet away from her because we're just, that's just not who you are. It's not the people that you are. So it does compound it that way. And it makes it difficult. We have done pieces where, for that immediate grieving period, we'll, have a family come in and have a small service and just say, hey, in May or June or July or August or whenever this happens, let's plan a real celebration, because that's one of the challenges that they're facing, that our families are facing, is they're not really concerned about themselves. They're concerned about mom or dad. They're going, mom and dad would have had hundreds of people here. And now we can only have 5, or we can only have 10, or we can only, nobody can come do an ID view with them, or come do visiting hours with them. It's only, not even my whole family can come because it's only 10 of us. So it's important that we help them look to the future. We help them now, help them with their grief now, stay in contact with them, but also help them plan something in the future, that they can do that, and they can have that 100 or 200 people there to celebrate mom or dad's life and be able to do it that way. So I think it's really important to do that.
And what strikes me, and I bet a lot of the clergy on the call in this meeting right now, Eric, is that we need to take care of you guys too, that you all as funeral professionals are on the front lines right now, even more so than we are, because you can have that physical presence and we can't. And hearing all of you describe the work you're doing makes me concerned for your well-being, and for clergy to be mindful of the stress and the burden that this is putting on folks doing the work that you're doing. So I encourage clergy to be mindful of that, and thank you. Carolyn, you're going to drive the bus, so have at it, my friend. Oh, I need to unmute. There you go. Now you're good.
All right. Jane, thank you. And thanks to all of the folks that have spoken today. You've been incredibly articulate, as well as giving us lots of good information. And I think that what I've heard more than anything else is that our roles as clergy and our roles as funeral directors, there's no boundary almost in between. We're both doing the work that the other has done, and that boundary has become very, very permeable at this point. And I think that when things are relaxed and when we finally catch up, that we ought to just plan a great big party for all of us, and because this really has been a very weighty time for those of us that are doing this kind of work. I heard, actually it was Doug Bibber's father at clergy retirement many years ago, about 30 years ago, who said, well, you guys are all one group. You're the Hatch'em, Match'em, Patch'em, and Dispatch'em crew. And when we stop and think about that, that's all about intimacy. It's all about intimacy. And there's nothing more intimate than walking with somebody when somebody they've loved has died. And like it or not, those folks who are serving as funeral directors and their staff, as well as people like us who are serving as clergy and our staff, are all in this together. And so I think, Jane, you kind of ended on that note that's really important. And that's that we need to make sure that each other is okay. I think we really need to make sure that each other is okay. So having said that, I also want to make sure, in case I don't have a chance later, to thank all the folks, both from Dignity as well as from Bibbers. You're all my colleagues, and it's my fault that you're here today. So Jane, thank you for asking me who I would suggest. I'm so grateful for all of you. I've got lots of questions. They're laid out in front of me. I'm going to try to coordinate some of them. Some of them have to do with the nuts and bolts. Some of them have to do with the larger things that we've been talking about today. And so I'm going to sort of try to group some of them together. We may not get to all of them, but we can certainly get answers and put them online along with what we have actually recorded today. So I'm going to start with a couple of nuts and bolts, and you all did a great job of explaining the roles, but here are some things that I haven't thought about. Jane, I don't know whether you have. So here's a question, and I can't see everybody on my screen. Can you see everybody, Jane? Because we're going to have to figure out how we choose who's going to answer these questions. Jane, you're muted.
Tell you what, I can see all of the funeral professionals. Okay. Wait, no, I'm missing somebody. I can see, where's Doug Bibber? Doug Bibber, oh, yep, I do. I have them all on my screen, so I'll let you know who raises their hand.
That would be great. Okay, so this first question is a question of nuts and bolts, but it's not something that I have thought about. It's actually a two-part question. If somebody dies out of state, are you being allowed to bring them back into the state of Maine, and how does that happen? And then there's a second part of the question, and it's this: can you actually have a body at home in this COVID-19 era? It's not something I've thought about.
I think, Kevin, was that you were willing to answer that question? Okay, let me unmute you. Kevin, you are on.
So that is a very interesting second part of that question. I'm not sure. I would assume if it's home, we would have to be part of that, so we'd probably have to use the guidelines that are in place right now. But if the person was not there and they just have a gathering at their house, then really the restrictions don't apply because we're not part of it. For instance, this weekend I had a family that they had a family service before they went to the cemetery at the family camp, and they had 40 people there. We were not part of it. The person, one of the children was actually a clergy member, and he kind of held his own service. And then we went to the cemetery for the committal where we met the family and only had 10 people. But as far as somebody passing away out of state, in order to get that person brought back home, they do need to be embalmed. So therefore, we can have services and viewing of that loved one because they will be embalmed, would have been embalmed in order to get, especially going on to commercial flights if they're going to be flown back to us. So the answer is yes, we can deal with people that have passed out of state.
Great.
Great, thanks for that answer. Again, we're learning more about this whole embalming deal because that's been something that people have been worried about. So I appreciate hearing more about that as well. Okay, so here is another sort of nuts and bolts, but it's important. If regarding the visits that are occurring actually in the chapels, in funeral chapels, and there are opportunities for groups of 5 people to meet, but they have to be scheduled at 15-minute increments. Do you have to, in between each one of those 15-minute groups, completely sanitize and clean that space that's being utilized?
Looks like Mike can answer that.
Yeah, and that, that's what we had proposed to the governor's office, and that's our professional responsibility to do that. As with any other businesses that are open, we have to engage in that. And as we've always said, most of these folks that have a funeral director's license did have epidemiology. They did have specialized education in disease transmission and control of transmissible diseases. So I think as a professional, we're proud to take that challenge on and do it in a very thoughtful manner.
That's great. And just a word about those 5-person viewings, Carolyn, I believe that unless they're from the same household and they're folks who live together, they would need to stay 6 feet apart even while they were in the room doing the viewing.
Right. Right. Thank you, Jane. It's good for us to hear those rules over and over and over again. Here's another nuts and bolts, but I think it's important, just having done a graveside service 3 days ago. I'm just saying that this would have been important information to know. So those of you that are still doing services, we know that there can be 10 people at a graveside service, but does that include people that are in their cars, or can there be additional folks if they actually remain in their cars? Good question. Good question.
Who wants to take that one? Doug Bibber.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that. The rule is 10 people. That 10 limit includes the clergy, minister, cemetery staff. So some of the aspects that we've done is we've asked the cemetery staff to stay over at maybe at their office or at a different part of the cemetery. For our funeral home staff, we will come in, take care of the arranging the gravesite, and then step our staff back and just leave one person there to assist the family and clergy. So that brings the number down, and obviously the clergy. And we're using, obviously, social distancing. We do bring chairs that we sanitize afterwards. And we set the chairs, and that's a visual reminder to stay 6 to 8 feet apart. I have had services where at the gravesite where we've kind of been together, it's been 10 people, but the grandchildren were 2 rows over from the gravesite, physically distanced, but they were able to witness their grandfather's military honors. So were we somewhat in violation? Yes and no. I mean, they were 30 to 40 feet away from us. So I think we have to take into account safety while doing it compassionately. So it's a fine line, and sometimes we have to. It's a balancing act every day, and we try to do the best we can. And I know as clergy members, you're trying to do the best we can, but we still maintain that separation from each other as best we can.
Carolyn, I think that the military honors triggered for me a reminder about communal singing or anyone singing. That
Yes.
If you were to have a soloist, say at the graveside, they would need to be where those grandkids were, 30 feet away. We're learning a whole lot about the epidemiology of aerosolized mist when someone's singing, even with a mask on. it's dangerous. And so you would need to have anybody doing that far away.
Yeah, we've just recently in the last couple of weeks heard about how far those minuscule particles travel if somebody is laughing or sneezing or coughing or singing. And it's another thing that we're going to all have to think about when we start having in-person worship services. So just curious about that. And so a great lead into another question, and it's sort of both what's going to happen beyond now as well as nuts and bolts. And somebody has asked about when church funeral service will actually be able to happen again. What this person is saying is that they've heard, and I didn't understand this from the guidelines I heard the other day, so I'm confused. So I'm looking for some guidance here, that churches will not be able to reopen until September. And yet we've heard from a couple of different funeral directors that we should be able to do funerals later this summer. So what is the guideline there? Are we going to be able to do church services prior to September?
Who wants to?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know what the guidelines are.
There aren't any. Nobody has said anything definitive yet. But funeral professionals, what have you heard about timing? Mike, you are.
Yeah, I can't say that we've heard any more than you have. And our professional folks who work with the governor's office as of Tuesday didn't have any additional feedback for us on that. So I wish I could give you the semblance of any type of a timeline, but we don't have any more info than you do.
Right. I think the other reality for us in church world is that whatever the state says, your own denomination may say something more strict. So it could be you're hearing something from a bishop or a district superintendent or some other judicatory leader that even if Governor Mills stood up and did the hula on June 1st and said, go for it, your denominational leader might say no. So you need to be mindful of that.
And whatever the guidelines are, we as clergy have to follow the strictest level of guidelines. And I expect that funeral directors do too. I can see that we're getting close to our ending. I've got 3 more questions for sure that I would like to ask. So the first one is this, a question about whether funeral directors are actually officiating at graveside services right now. Is that something that you're finding that you need to do? And any of you could probably answer that question.
I see Eric's hand up. Oh, go ahead. There you go.
So the graveside services that we've been having, we have been reaching out to the clergy that took care of the family prior to that to come to do the graveside service, or if they have a particular relationship with a clergy member, we have reached out to the clergy to do that. So for the most part, I know I am not. It is something that if it was a last resort, we could do and probably would do for the family. But for the most part, again, going back to making it as normal as possible. So.
Okay. There was an additional part to that, just saying that in York, some of the clergy have offered to go and bless the graves if somebody from the funeral home has actually officiated the service. So I think, again, it's what we're all doing to do things in new ways and to sort of try to work out of the box if we can do that. So 2 more questions. And this one is very interesting, and it came from more than one person. And it's about fees, because some people are doing something now, some people are doing something now and something later. And so is there going to be a change in the fees that funeral homes charge because of these COVID-19 guidelines? I wonder if anybody can answer that, and you may have different answers, but I think several people would like to hear about fees because of COVID-19.
I see Doug Bibber with an answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's, and when you say fees, I'm assuming you're referring to funeral home costs. Predominantly, a predominant number of the funeral homes and directors that I'm speaking with, and for us, we have our traditional fee structure where we assist families with services. For families that are deciding to have services now and then a delayed service for the public afterwards, we generally aren't charging a second for that second time. We're taking into account the unusual circumstances today and willing to, provide that service down the road. So I think most funeral homes are taking that into account. And, each funeral home may do that differently. It may be that the fees are itemized out now, but they relate to services down the road not occurring now. So that's, from what I'm gathering, listening to my folks that I talk to and here in our firm, that's kind of what we're looking at. Trying to make those accommodations without penalizing anybody.
Right. And I think that clergy are doing exactly the same thing, saying, okay, if you want, I don't need to get paid for both, because it's sort of like one extended service in some ways. So, yeah. All right. Okay. I think that this is going to have to be the final question, but I'm going to sort of move a couple of different comments and questions together. And somebody wrote and said, when all of this has changed and we're back to doing what we normally do, it probably is going to be brutal on both clergy as well as on funeral directors. And I think that's absolutely the case. And we've spoken a little bit about that. But here's a specific question. Does it make any sense to think about creating some kind of a position like within churches, like church funeral coordinator that might do a lot of this coordinating between the clergy, not just the churches, but the clergy, the churches, and the funeral homes? Because I think that we're all going to be overwhelmed. And we were talking about spring burials, but I think that we're going to get the triad. We Christians do everything in threes. And we're going to, at some point later on, be dealing with three different groups of people. We're going to be doing the regular spring burials. We're going to be doing those services for people who have chosen to postpone until a later date. What I didn't hear anybody saying is, and we're going to have to be dealing with current services. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot to be thinking about. So I'd love to hear, particularly from funeral directors, if you think it would be wise for clergy and churches to develop some kind of a position that we might call church coordinator. Anybody want to answer that? And maybe more than one person would like to answer that.
I see Mike and Eric both have their hands up. Mike, go ahead.
First and foremost, it is with great optimism that we look forward to having all of these services. The reality is, as this continues on, and if restrictions remain in place, and they might absolutely need to be for health reasons, but when a family's come into July or August and they've had their summer get together and everything like that, they may not be having a service anymore. So that is an unfortunate reality that certainly is in the back of my mind. Again, I'm an optimist like everyone on this call. And so what a great problem to have too many families to help them honor their loved one. Yeah, I think a coordinator would be great. Kevin Simino talked about staying in touch with those families weekly. This is a chance right now, families thinking about it, funeral directors reaching out to them. Maybe we're filling them with all kinds of cool ideas. They're thinking of great ways to honor and celebrate their loved ones live. By the time the restrictions are lifted, and let's say it's July or whatnot, and the family's had 3 months to think about and mentally plan the perfect memorial, it would be great to have a coordinator to assist, because frankly, it's a lot on you with your normal ministerial duties, the deaths that are normally actually occurring, as well as spring burials and so forth. It really could be a lot. And let's face it, if you've been waiting for something for 4 months, you're going to have awful high expectations. So we want to do it right and make sure that it's special and meaningful. So those are just my thoughts on the topic. I know it's all over the place. But.
Jane, do you see anybody else that wants to answer that?
I think we're good, and we're coming up on our time. And Carolyn, do you have any last words, thoughts, closing remarks?
Well, I'd like to just pick up on what that last question was and how Mike answered it. And for me, and I spoke with the Bibbers about this the other day, we all as clergy wind up by doing and assisting with services for families that we've never met before. They're not members of our churches. And I think that that's really, really important. I've always said that every family, every grieving family needs somebody to walk with them in that respect. And so I was speaking with Doug Bibber the other day, and I think for me, it would be great to be connected with families now, even if they're not members of the church that I'm currently serving. And because I think that we can assist the funeral directors and the family if we can begin our conversations now.
That's great.
So I think that for me, that would be really important too, even though we don't know what's going to happen down the road. I guess my final thought is I'm just really grateful for all of the folks that have been on this call today, both the clergy that have taken the time to be here, as well as the folks from the funeral homes. And I have to say that working with both Dignity and Bibbers, that I have had a collegial relationship and a relationship as friends with all of these people. And so I trust all of you implicitly, and I am so incredibly grateful for that. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jane. Thank you for moderating.
And thank you, Carolyn. Carolyn does a lot of work with these funeral homes and with funerals, not only of church members, but of people from the community. And it's because of her connections and relationships that this webinar was possible. So I am deeply grateful to her leadership on this, for her leadership on this. And thank you to everybody, whether you are a funeral professional or a clergy person. We know how hard you are working and how much you care. And thank you for what you are doing for the families that need you now more than ever. We're with you. We're in this together. And the council will try in every way that we can to support you and give you the resources that you need. And that will include some follow-up to today's webinar with the link to watch the recording if there's anything you missed, or if you have a colleague that you think would like to benefit from all the wisdom that was shared today. We'll get that out to you, and it will also be on our Facebook page and our website by next week. Thank you. You've given us all a lot to think about and pray about, and we will be praying for all of you and supporting you with our professionalism and our logistical help, as well as our spiritual support. So thank you all for being here today. Good to see so many familiar faces, and we will be in touch. I have your email addresses, and we'll make sure that you know when the recording becomes available. Blessings on all of you. Have a great weekend, despite the snow. It's May. Yeah. It's May. Be well, everyone. Be safe. Goodbye.